Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Big Changes in Broadband, the Pandemic-Induced Broadband Pivot of 2020, presented by AppGeo in partnership with the National States Geographic Information Council. My name is Bridget, and I am the Deputy Director at NSGIC. If you are unfamiliar with our organization, NSGIC exists to advance effective national coordination of geospatial information by supporting state-level cooperation. We serve as a national forum for the development of capable and future-oriented geospatial leadership. And if you'd like any more information about us, we do have a great conference coming up next week. Please visit our website at www.nsgic.org, and we hope to see you next week. And I will hand it over now to Aaron. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. And for everyone who is just joining us today, thank you for attending this presentation, Big Changes in Broadband, the Pandemic-Induced Broadband Pivot of 2020. And I'm just going to walk through a couple introductions here, and then we'll be getting our show on the road. I first want to just let you all know that this webinar is part of an ongoing webinar series. You can view all of our upcoming events at appgeo.com/events, as well as past recordings. We have a full calendar coming for next year, along with a handful of more events for 2020. So be sure to check those out if you enjoyed today's presentation. I just wanted to introduce quickly our panel of speakers. First and foremost, Bill Johnson, our Carpe Geo evangelist here at AppGeo. He was the former GIO for New York and led their broadband mapping program, all from 2009 to 2014. So this subject is near and dear to Bill's heart, and he has spent 2 years at USAC on national broadband issues. Kate Hickey, Vice President here at AppGeo, has been supporting broadband mapping for 6 states between 2009 and 2014, and has served a long tenure of 19 years here at AppGeo, and she leads our consulting services team. So anything services, Kate is our woman. And we are more than happy to be joined by Bert Granberg today from the Wasatch Front Regional Council. He's the analytics director there, and previously served as the GIO for Utah and led their broadband mapping program, again, from 2009 to 2014. Common set of years here, I think you'll find. And he's now applying those geospatial and geoanalytics workflows at the MPO for Salt Lake City. So a great cast of characters today, and I really look forward to hearing what they have to say. And from here, I'm going to hand it over to Kate to introduce AppGeo.
All right, thank you, Aaron. I just wanted to take a quick moment to introduce AppGeo for those of you who might not be familiar with us. We're a geospatial IT firm, and we were founded back in 1991, and we're headquartered in Boston, although we do have staff in, I believe, 11 states across the country now. We do all things geospatial, data development, data transformation. We build complex applications. We do business system integration, geoanalytics, and have worked with quite a few states doing strategic and business plans and return on investment studies. We've been active in NSGIC for many years. We're really excited about the conference next week and seeing how it all plays out in this new format. And we think a lot about the ways that we can serve this thriving community. And today, we look forward to diving into the topic of broadband with you all. So I will be engaging Bill and Bert in a conversation about some of the history of the broadband program. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of that history and the perspectives that they gained in their former roles as GIOs for New York and Utah. We'll then pivot the conversation to focus on where we're headed with the new program and how we might do things differently, and the important role that GIOs and other agencies have in the process. As you listen, go ahead, as Aaron pointed out, keep feeding us any questions or comments you might have, and we can add those into the discussion at the end. So as we are all aware and experiencing, as we sit here at our homes, the current COVID pandemic has really pushed broadband to the front and center of our national consciousness. in a way that nothing else before has been able to do. It really goes without saying that our daily lives have undergone this incredible shift to the online world. And in a few years, we'll likely look back on this pandemic as really the turning point, that big pivot when we as a nation finally recognized the urgent need to close the digital divide. There's a powerful connection and a dependence between improved broadband, the normalization of online interactions and communities, and the expansion of technology to improve life and work and education and really all the foundations of our existence right now. So Bill, I'd like to ask you if you could describe some of the changes in a bit more detail, changes that we're all seeing now.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kate, for that introduction. And as Aaron said earlier, this is a subject near and dear to my heart. So I think it's very clear that there are some very big changes happening right now. First of all, we're seeing a massive shift to the work from home situation. And because of that, a lot of companies and government agencies alike are seeing that remote work actually is quite practical for lots of jobs. And they are, in many cases, reassessing their office requirements going forward. We're seeing schools across the country going either entirely online this fall or using a blend of online and in classroom with a lot of social distancing protocols in place. And we're seeing that colleges in a lot of places across the country are struggling with outbreaks of COVID-19 with college students in high density on campuses now. In fact, one of the State University of New York campuses very close to where I live had to shut down and send 5,000 students home because they had a significant outbreak. And the local school system right in the village where I live is giving parents the option of either all online or this hybrid approach. I think that's typical across the country. So in addition to employment and education, which really are major quality of life factors, we see broadband becoming a major element of other parts of our lives as well, including healthcare, entertainment, retail, and it doesn't stop there. Some of these changes are likely to be permanent at some level when this pandemic resides. And all of them have downstream effects that we need to be thinking about. For example, demand for commercial office space in downtown areas is very likely to decline substantially. And as Bert's going to tell you in more detail going forward here, the transportation sector is seeing a shift back to single occupancy cars away from mass transit as a result of the pandemic. And in terms of mass transit, any of those systems that rely on the fare box for their revenues are in really, really deep financial straits because the ridership is down so substantially. So the pandemic has accelerated changes across the spectrum. But what it's also pointing out is that all of this assumes that people have access to the online world. And so the folks that are on the wrong side of this digital divide are left out from all of these things. And that's a major problem. Even in the outer suburbs of the capital city of New York State, where I live, we're seeing a surprising number of unserved or underserved people. I see cars in the parking lot of our town library every day. Even though the library is closed, people are showing up to access the library's Wi-Fi network from their cars. And this is only 20 miles from the state capitol.
That's so right, Bill. And, we're all experiencing these differentiators firsthand, and we're seeing pictures in the news of how this is hitting home for so many. There was a recent picture in the newspaper of some elementary kids sitting out on the sidewalk outside of a Taco Bell so that they could access the Wi-Fi and get their homework done. The issues on broadband access are certainly real. And all of us on this panel worked in some capacity on the broadband mapping program funded by the 2008 Recovery Act that created all these grants to the states in that 2009 to 14 timeframe. So, I'll ask you, Bill, based on all of that effort and investment and previous mapping work, it seems that we really should have a good handle on where all these unserved people live. Is that the case?
Yeah. And, for starters, we actually have to talk about the definition of what it means to be unserved. FCC maintains that definition, and they've upgraded it a number of times since that mapping program of 2008 to 14. The current definition, which has been on the books for a few years now, is a speed of 25 megabits per second downstream and 3 megabits per second upstream, sometimes referred to as 25.3. And actually, even at the FCC, they still use the older definition of 10.1 for a few hard to serve rural areas in the country for their subsidy programs. And, when we did that mapping program earlier, the base definition was 768 kilobits per second down, 256 up, which is dial-up modem speed. Remember dial-up modems? And so where we set this definition has a big impact of where the lines are drawn on the map. And I'd like to show you some images here that I screen grabbed from the FCC's website here. All right, so this is this first one is county level data showing counties that are unserved in white, and the pink are served. So the white areas are everybody that's unserved at a definition of 4.1. Let's move to the next one. Notice how it shifts here a little bit when we switch to 10.1, which was the definition at the end of that 2009 to 14 program period. They had upgraded the definition to this level. So there's what it means to be unserved at 10.1. Let's move now to the next speed tier. And this is 2019 data we're looking at, by the way. So here's 25 down, 3 up. This is the current definition of broadband speed in the U.S. So you can see the white has grown substantially, which means that some of those other areas that had service that no longer meets the FCC minimum definition. And so what we get out of this is just the definition of broadband has a big impact. And there's another factor with the speed definition in that we don't have a standard speed test. There is no single authoritative speed test. And as the companies that provide broadband service will be quick to tell you, these speed tests are not totally reliable because they're also dependent on things like what else you have running on the machine that you use to take the test, or if you're too far from your Wi-Fi router at home when you take the test, and things like that. So just the definition of broadband and how we measure it has a lot to do with how we define unserved. And so the other part of this is it's not a binary problem. It's not just served or unserved. What my own family experienced when we were all stuck at home starting in March with the pandemic, suddenly it wasn't just me working from home, but my wife needed to be working from home as well. And we had our high school senior daughter at home doing online learning. And we found that the service that we had wasn't up to meeting the demand for 3 people being online all day long. So we had to upgrade to a higher speed of service. Unfortunately, there are lots of areas in the country where that option doesn't exist. They may only be at the minimum level of service to meet the FCC definition and qualify as served, but not in a way that meets the needs that you have with multiple people needing access during the pandemic.
Yeah, so I just wanted to interrupt real quick and just say that your experience is pretty typical. I think underserved becomes a little bit more complex during work at home and school at home, and I've got some stuff I can show a little bit later to support that. And it wouldn't be a webinar without someone having muting problems. So sorry.
Good, so we got that out of the way early. That's excellent. All right, so the mapping that we have available today from the FCC, the official national broadband mapping, is really not substantially different than what we did from 2009 to 14. I want to show you, I did a screen grab, again, off the FCC site today. So there's 110, but I want to go one more slide, if you would, Aaron. So this is an image I captured this morning off the FCC site. When you zoom in further, you actually see the census block level of detail. Now, the current mapping is at this level of granularity. It goes no deeper than census blocks. And in rural areas, census blocks get larger and larger. And this is a blow up in the northwest part of the state of Arkansas. You can see the city of Fayetteville, where the University of Arkansas is, over on the left side. And it's a quite rural area in the edge of the Ozarks. And you can see this census blocks get significantly larger as you move away from Fayetteville and into the rural countryside. And what you see are a lot of census blocks showing up as magenta, meaning served at 25.3. The way that current mapping works is if the providers report a single location in any of those blocks that has service, the whole block is coded as served. So it masks a lot of unserved people. I am sure that if you were to check with the households in these magenta blocks in Northwest Arkansas, you would find that a great many of them in these, quote, served blocks lack broadband service. So the current mapping that we have, which is used by policymakers to decide funding levels and how to direct our activities to close the divide, is based on mapping that does not meet the need. We cannot tell exactly which households are served and which are unserved. And it's a bit of an irony to me that because of this census block model, the blocks get bigger and bigger, less granular in rural areas, the map is worst in the areas where we need it most to be accurate.
With all this data, fuzziness, and uncertainty, it sounds like we're in dire need of a better broadband mapping program.
Yeah. And it's easy in hindsight to be critical of what we did, from 2009 to 14. But you have to remember that prior to that, there was no comprehensive broadband map. There was no way to know how many providers served your neighborhood or what speeds were available. And there was no nationwide view on who was served and unserved. And what I think is really remarkable is that in less than 2 years, we went from having no national broadband data to having a seamless map built across the country. And to me, it proved the value of a federated approach to building nationwide data sets, where you have states acting as the agents to get the work done and building it to national standards promulgated by a federal agency, so that things had a uniform data model and were built consistently. And to me, that's a proven model that we ought to bear in mind when we're thinking about some of these other layers of the NSDI that are still not up to an A grade on a report card.
I'm just going to jump in here. I think that I can get in my Wayback Machine and I can go back to 2010, and the map that you're showing of Arkansas is pretty fitting because and the fact that we're discussing this on an ISJIC webinar is really fitting as well, because really when this opportunity came out, the ISJIC members were following the Federal Register and the grant materials, and they figured out pretty quickly that a data model, specifically a GIS data model, was really needed by this project. And we worked together. I think Larry Dalby in Arkansas led this out. We created a geodatabase schema, and we pushed it back at NTIA at the federal level and said, we think you should use this, and they did. So I think that illustrates the importance of getting involved in policy issues and trying to figure out where you can make a difference. So that was pretty cool. Another memory of mine is in the Utah Broadband Project. I witnessed a few attempts to bring stakeholders together and talk about, in particular, rural broadband issues, and also broadband issues at the urban municipal level. And the problem before the project was no one could agree on the facts. No one could agree what the problem was, where it was, and people just didn't have productive discussions on the topic at a policy level. And bringing together that map of the lay of the land, really, I think it was a really key catalyst to getting the policy folks to sit down, have some common ground to reflect upon, and figure out what next steps would be. And I think that led, that and a few other factors, that really led to rural broadband in Utah getting a huge jump start. So that was pretty cool to watch. Last thought, I think maybe all along we should have been mapping where broadband isn't instead of where it is. And I think that your maps are a good illustration of that, Bill. That's, of course, a hindsight 2020 observation, but for sure what's needed now is mapping where broadband is not sufficient or doesn't exist. And one of the issues is that isn't sufficient keeps changing, and it's certainly changed in this work and school at home environment. And Aaron's got a slide up. This shows an article that I saw in the New York Times a month ago, and it's this is in suburban Utah, and these are college kids who have rented a house for the year to attend Grinnell College, which is located in rural Iowa. And this is how they're going to do college for the year, given COVID. This house went from needing to support broadband for maybe, well, it's Utah, so maybe a large family, to, supporting maybe a dozen college kids who are going to be doing everything online for the year. And I think that that's kind of an interesting illustration of the times. Beyond these likely privileged college kids, from an education and COVID perspective, a map of low-income neighborhoods and public Wi-Fi resources and other broadband connectivity would really be at the top of my list today if I was, actively engaged in the education policy space.
Yeah, thanks, Bert. Those are really important points, and those data layers, those maps would be top of my list too. And you also give us a good segue to talk about, move from the past to what's happening now, and how's the country going to close this digital divide if the mapping has all these deficiencies, or if we really can't see where those in need are. So, Bill, how about you go first?
Sure. So the really good news is we're going to have a much better broadband mapping program starting very soon. And that's thanks to federal legislation that was passed this year and that the FCC is preparing to implement starting next year. It's called the Broadband Data Act. And under this act, the whole process is changing. So companies are no longer going to be reporting data at the census block level of granularity. Instead, the companies are going to be required to report service area polygons. And the FCC has yet to establish the rules for how the carriers will do that, but it seems likely that there will be a variety of methods, such as you see here, maybe buffering the roads where their wiring is attached to the poles, or drawing a polygon around all the areas that they can provision within 10 business days, which is the rule that they operate under at FCC. Or for the wireless carriers, perhaps they can submit a polygon that's based on a propagation model that shows a certain level of signal availability on a wireless network. So the way this is going to work is that the carriers will submit this set of polygons, and then at the FCC will be using something they're going to call the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, or simply the fabric. And that's essentially address points. It's all the point locations where it makes sense to provision a broadband connection. And so what they'll be doing is an overlay process. And it should be familiar to everybody in the GIS world as a point and polygon spatial join. So what they're going to do here is take the service provider polygon that is submitted by the carrier, and then at the FCC, they'll have this data set called the broadband fabric, and they'll do this overlay. And what you will see, as shown on the next slide, is that will generate the identification of which of those point locations are served and which of them are not. So we're finally going to have, at the national level, broadband data at the specific address location level. Wow, yay! Finally we'll know the served from the unserved. And this is a huge thing. We expect that the FCC is going to be issuing an RFP next year to acquire the fabric, and it seems likely that they will use commercial sources for that purpose. They've had an open comment period that closed about 2 weeks ago, and NISJIC submitted written comments during that comment period recommending that the National Address Database be considered as a source for the fabric. It's probably not likely that the NAD, because it's incomplete, would be selected by the FCC to do that. But I think it's important that NISJIC was on the record as recommending a public data source as opposed to a commercial data source for this important national policy work. But I also want to point out, this new program is very, very different than the original program, which involved grants to the states to do the work. There will be no grant program to the states under the new program, but states will still have a way to impact the map. And the way that's going to work is that FCC, and this is important, and I want to stress this, FCC under the old program was relying entirely on the carriers submitting accurate data. And it was assumed that what they submitted was true and accurate. And under the new program, the carriers will be submitting these service polygons, and the FCC will be overlaying it with the fabric. But they're going to implement two new provisions to ensure that there's additional checks against what the carrier has provided and what exists in the broadband fabric. And the first of those is that they're going to be promoting nationwide crowdsourcing. And this is something that states can definitely engage on. You can engage your local and regional partners. You, I'm sure, know of organizations that are interested in this within your state that can encourage people to check their areas. And you also probably know which parts of your state are most in need of broadband service, where the gaps are, and can engage those groups to participate in the crowdsourcing. The other piece, which is probably most significant to this group today, is that FCC is going to have something called a challenge process. And this is something where you would submit data to the FCC to challenge either the results of their map or the underlying data sets that they use to create the map. For example, you might say that the broadband fabric missed some address points that you can show from a state address database that you may be using for other purposes. So this is a really important set of checks that are hopefully going to result in a much more accurate, in addition to a more granular national broadband map. And what this really points out to me is that the importance of address data for this, because you probably already have work either in discussion or ongoing in your state around NextGen 911 that needs accurate address data. And so here's another important use case. And you can stack these use cases up, and there's way more than just public safety and broadband, as you well know, and build a business case to get moving on address data if you aren't already.
Thanks, Bill. That's a really useful summary, and I hope everyone heard your advice loud and clear there, that this is a great opportunity for states to get involved in the data validation and in the challenge process. So, Bert, do you have anything to add to Bill's assessment?
Of course. One of the things that we did in Utah during the state broadband project was about midway through the funded period, we proposed to build a statewide address point data set and use broadband funding, about 13,000 per county, to give mini grants to counties to develop their first ever address point data set. And they did it. I mean, it was a small amount of money, but it was something that they knew that they needed anyway. And it just wasn't enough to leverage their existing interests and get them going on that. And all of the counties submitted data. One decided they didn't need the money, but they would submit it anyway. And that address point data set is still actively being re-aggregated statewide by Matt Peters and his crew at AGRC. And I keep finding different ways to use it in my role at the Salt Lake MPO. So it's kind of cool. But I assume that this is going to be a useful resource, piece of data for Utah's challenge process when and if it comes to that. And that's kind of cool, because initially this data set was born in the broadband project. And then the big use case became NextGen 911 and using that statewide. And then there are all these other use cases, but now it's come 360 degrees and it's back to being used to support broadband policy. And I mean, I think that this example illustrates how states that actively participated in the original broadband project, they just got a step ahead, in particular on addresses. And I think that there's a little bit of a lesson there. And it's to me, it's just really strong evidence that state GIS offices need to connect with these big policy issues. They need to think big. They need to watch what's happening at the national level. It's just, these opportunities don't come very often, so you don't want to let one get away.
Thanks, Bert. I really like how you connect that to these bigger themes and issues, and inspire states to think big there. What I'd like to do now is take advantage of your current experience and your current role and shift from a national perspective to the local perspective. And, now, Bert, that you're working at an MPO and dealing with local issues, mostly related to urban transportation planning, how are you seeing broadband play out at that level?
Yeah, I mean, as Bill mentioned earlier, we're seeing that everything is changing. And I think everybody on this call knows that. And as sort of our patterns, travel patterns, work patterns, school patterns change, the policy questions change a little bit, maybe even dramatically in some cases. From a community perspective, what's important to them now is different than what was important to them 6 months ago. So Google has a great resource for viewing how demand for activities and travel has changed generally during the COVID-19 era. And they measure change relative to a pre-pandemic baseline. And you can go in and look at any county in the country. This is all based on smartphone data, but you can see sort of how those patterns have changed relative to retail. And this says recreation. I think it's really more like retail and dining out and that type of stuff. Grocery and pharmacy are up a little bit. Parks are way, way up. And as Bill mentioned, transit use is down. Trips to the workplace are down. Trips locally around the neighborhood and from one residence to another are up noticeably. So yeah, I mean, like, we're all kind of aware of this. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but a colleague of mine, if you can go to the next slide, has looked at this question of what will the future look like on the other side of the pandemic, and just done some kind of back of the napkin estimates. And what he is calling this is he's calling it the Great Localization. And in the Great Localization, broadband matters more in sort of different accelerated use kind of ways. And what's immediately around where you live and spend your time is more important. So this great localization, he sees that some of these trends are gonna stay. Especially retail is likely to lose participation. Workplace trips to work down 40% in our area relative to the baseline are going to rise back, but not maybe make it to normal because we've figured out that broadband's allowing us to work from home more effectively. Transit trips, we think they're going to rebound. They already have started to rebound and accelerate towards a normal, but they've got a long way to go. There was a time in Salt Lake, and I think this is true nationally, where you just couldn't find a bicycle to buy. Bike trips and park usage, open space, trailheads and parking lots are just getting mobbed. And freeway volumes have come close to recovering because of the fact that people aren't taking transit and they aren't carpooling. And that's actually going to put more pressure on the infrastructure. And the question is from a long-range planning perspective or even a mid-range planning perspective is how long that's going to persist. And if we go back to working at the level that we did at the workplace with all these single occupancy vehicles, congestion is going to be a big, we're going to see traffic problems that we haven't had before. And so that's why there's a decent amount of faith that things like transit will rebound. I think the last thing I would mention on this, with broadband being so important and local amenities being so important, is that there's definitely an equity dimension to this. And that's going to be an important thing for policymakers and elected officials to watch to try to ensure that quality of life for all of their constituency, but maybe especially in education, can be kept at the highest possible level.
Thanks, Bert. It's really interesting to see this analysis, and while the numbers are kind of stunning to look at, and especially as it might play out in the future, again, it aligns perfectly with many of our personal experiences here. So I hadn't considered how important broadband could be in these local planning situations, and I imagine it must really be disrupting the way you forecast the future here. So, how are those planning and forecasting models being adjusted to accommodate this?
Well, the short answer is it's still from the standpoint of long-range transportation planning, where we're looking out 20 to 30 years, and even some of the shorter range project selection and prioritization, where we're looking out 4 to 6 years. It's still pretty early to figure out what the impact is going to be. And you just have to remember that transportation planners are, prior to the epidemic, were thinking about how autonomous vehicles were going to change everything. So, they're in it for the kind of the long haul in terms of the dynamics and disruptions and things like that. But I think it's not too early to think about how broadband and work at home will change the demand for commercial office space and some other things like that. Like larger houses and the proximity to amenities relative to like maybe core work areas. And then, like key amenities. Well, like what is a key amenity? Like it's not what we thought it was. Who out there really is interested in being close to movie theaters? Parks are probably higher on the list, and movie theaters are probably a little bit lower now.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. So there's a lot at stake here, and I think with our remaining time here, I think we should shift our focus to our audience and actions that a state GIO or really anyone in a state agency can take in this process. So, Bill, I'd like to ask you, what advice would you want to share with our audience today?
Great. Thanks, Kate. So first of all, not everybody in our audience today is a state GIO. You might be involved at some other level at the state, but I think having that big picture view is important. And I think what I think is most important in my mind is to support the needs of policymakers. And I want to just state that for emphasis another way. I think the highest and best function of a state GIS office is to provide that information that informs policymakers. And you notice I'm using the word information as opposed to data. They're different things. Data is a raw ingredient, and information is what informs and provides insights and helps a policymaker understand the situation. And really, GIS is unparalleled in the ability to take these complex situations and show what's going on and help people understand that. So really, the state GIS offices and smart leaders at the state level are staying closely tuned to the policy issues and the needs of policymakers. And that's going to be different state by state. We know that there's a big shift, and this is something that I haven't seen happen so quickly before. These policy issues, there's a natural cycle of things changing with policy issues, but there's just been such a rapid shift to all these broadband-driven policy issues, and they're being layered on top of other ongoing priority issues, things like, resilience to climate change and severe weather and public safety. Those aren't going to go away, but now we're adding to them these policy questions around things that are related to access to the online world. And so the kinds of questions that policymakers are going to be struggling with in the months and years ahead, and they're going to be doing this, by the way, in an environment of economic stress and uncertainty and probably very tight budgets, but they're going to be asking about things like, where are the households that don't have broadband that meets the current needs of today? Not just that binary, are they served or unserved, but do they have access to the broadband that rises to the challenge of what we're up against today? Where are we going to do fiber builds to support economic development, real high bandwidth things? What are we doing about these downtown areas where there's probably going to be a big shift in the demand for downtown commercial space? Where are the businesses going to be that survive this this pandemic, and where do we need to focus our economic incentives around the business community, and many, many more questions related to that, including some of the equity questions that are really more difficult. What do we do about not just making sure that there is broadband available, but is it affordable? So where are these communities that have the kind of the double whammy of not adequate broadband, but also can't afford it, and so they're left across on the wrong side of the digital divide as well. So it's really going to be important for states that are providing these geospatial resources to help illuminate these problems and to help shine a light on where specifically the problems are and where these things overlap and how they can be dealt with. It's going to be a geoanalytics drill, and that's what I want to emphasize as the need that should be met here.
When you think about all the demands competing for a GIO's attention, or really any state agency leader's attention, I mean, how does this relate? How does this rank in terms of other priorities that they're dealing with?
Yeah, well, that's a really important question, Kate. And, the good news is that I think, the questions I was asking here about, these policy issues, most of the data exists to do that. And the upcoming challenge process for the FCC is another one. And I think, there's a lot of attention needed to deal with these high quality address points. For me, the number one data need is going to be address data, and when you layer on all these other requirements around address data for statewide geocoding, for geo-enabled elections, for the business uses of e-commerce sites that state agencies need, and Next Gen 911, they all point to the need for quality address data. So that should rise to a high priority.
And Bert, would you agree that address data may be the single most important data set for us all to be focusing on?
Well, I'm not going to disagree with Bill. Address points, as he points out, they're critical to so many policy issues and the delivery of goods and services, especially within, I shouldn't even say especially, government and private delivery of services. If you think about it, address points, they're the Rosetta Stone that translates between how humans think about addresses, street name, house number, and how computers and databases and other machines need to use location as coordinates. So we're super important, especially when subunit addresses start to become more available. So I think that's a focus area that even if you have an address point data set, that's the next step, and hopefully we all get there. For my money, nothing really beats the importance of ensuring access to up-to-date aerial imagery, and road center lines, and parcels, and local boundaries, and LiDAR. Those 6 layers, they should all be the focus of a GIO office and its partners, which includes your local MPOs and certainly your DOT. And hopefully you've built and or are building relationships with those families of agencies. So, all that stuff's important. Address points for sure is on the list. It wouldn't have been if we asked this question 10 years ago. And all those data resources have a direct use within broadband policy analysis.
Yeah, they're all most important, right? I'm going to quote you on your Rosetta Stone analogy there. I love that notion as a way to distill the translation that happens there. I think this emphasis on supporting policymakers is something that GIOs and others naturally want to do. But do you two have any advice on how best to do that?
Sure. And Bert, I also love that Rosetta Stone thing, which I hadn't heard previously. That's really good. I'm gonna reuse that, I think, and call it my idea. I think this idea of supporting policymakers, this is not a new idea, and I think state leaders, get that. And as I, mentioned earlier, we've seen this big shift in pandemic-driven shift in new policy questions. And we, posed a bunch of them here just a couple of minutes ago. And these are going to be very difficult to answer. And so I think they lead to some follow-up questions for people that run state programs to answer. And for example, do I have the data to answer those policy questions? Where are my gaps? Where are my analytics gaps? Where are my resource delivery gaps? And because these are new questions that weren't on your plate in many cases 6 months ago, how do these align with your strategic plan? Your strategic plan really ought to be like the spinal cord that aligns the activities of your office so that everything you do is in support of rather than an obstacle to reaching your strategic goals. And so if your strategic plan is more than 6 months old, in other words, before the pandemic, you probably need to do something to revisit your strategic plan to make sure that everything is still in alignment, to make sure that the kinds of things you're going to need to do to answer those policy questions, if you really are going to support policymakers, what needs to shift with your strategic plan.
Yeah, great. And Bert, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I'll try. So we had a map of Arkansas up on the map. So I think I saw that maybe Shelby was up on this call and Jonathan. So shout out to you all. But one of the quotes that I reuse all the time, or at least paraphrase all the time, is something that the Arkansas GIS office staff use to talk about their work with legislative and the legislative and the executive branch space. And that is, their issue is the issue. My work at WFRC, just like in the state of Utah, I tried to push myself to fully embrace that perspective and keep looking for opportunities to make a specific difference for others outside of sort of our immediate technology GIS field. Keep offering to partner and assist and keep trying to make new connections, maybe even setting a monthly goal to connect with someone new every month. And also just keep promoting what we do. And I think that that's something what we can all improve upon. I'm still really proud of the Map of the Month concept that we came up for our state broadband project. We did over 70 maps and blog posts as part of that series. And it was really well received. I just a few months ago started that same concept at Wasatch Front Regional Council. And it took like 2 or 3 months for people to fully expect that was just going to happen. And they also liked it. So a little bit of shameless self-promotion is always a good thing, I think. In short, I think we all just need to get in touch with our extrovert sides a little bit more. I know that's hard for some of us, myself included. But developing that sort of outward-facing mindset is really important to success. It's really what's going to help find and connect to the best set of resources and allies and innovation and just general solid positioning within our field.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both. And thank you to our friends in Arkansas too. I like that quote as well. So with the last few minutes that we have here before the end of the hour, let's open it up to questions from the audience. I know a few have come in at least.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I'll let you, Aaron, facilitate those.
And just a quick reminder here, it's definitely not too late to submit a question. So feel free to write them in as we go through the Q&A here. The first one coming in from Neil, I think a good friend of AppGeo here. Why not a hybrid of the NAD and other address sources? You get the NAD standardization, quality, and completeness will likely be greater than from commercial sources. So any comments there?
Yeah, this bill, so I'll take that. So, Neil, you probably ought to take a look at the comments that NISJIC submitted to the FCC. I don't know what NISJIC has done to make those available or to post them on the website, but that might be a smart thing to do. But we did recommend that very thing, that to the extent that NAD is incomplete, use commercial sources as a gap fill to close those. And as additional data comes online from the states, replace the commercial data with the NAD data. So that idea was recommended.
Great. A few more questions coming in. I see some good ones. Here's another one to Bill. Bill, do you know when the challenge process will start? I assume that's the challenge process for the FCC under the Data Act.
Right. So, the Broadband Data Act has a time frame for implementation in it, and FCC is complying with that. But I also know that FCC does not have all the funding that they need. They need Congress to approve the rest of the funding that they're going to need to implement the Broadband Data Act. So there's a bit of a contingency there that I can't answer. But it's my understanding is it will be sometime in 2021 when the new mapping program will begin, and that it does include the challenge process when it kicks off. Excellent. Sorry, I can't be more specific.
Excellent. Some other good questions coming in here. I know our town has some public Wi-Fi access points, but there's no centralized resource to show where the coverage is available. Do you know of any approaches to synthesize this coverage information? I'm not aware of one, and actually these kind of public Wi-Fi points are not going to be part of the National Broadband Map. The National Broadband Map is the commercially available broadband networks, and so to the extent that there are Wi-Fi points at Taco Bell and whatnot, those do not end up in the National Broadband Map.
Kurt, do you have any thoughts on that from the local perspective? Yeah,
I mean, I mentioned it a little bit as a wish list item, but I think that in talking with your broadband stakeholders, they'll have some ideas for how that might be accomplished. I mean, and there are various flavors of sort of public-facing Wi-Fi, but kids know.
Yeah, just ask a teenager. I will throw in one recommendation, as we've seen some towns on our AppGeo platform, very different topic, but it's a town-wide mapping solution. We've seen some towns actually publish where you can get free Wi-Fi on there. So feel free to check us out if you want to learn more about that. Let's see, another question coming in. This one I think is for Bert. What could you please repeat the 6 recommended layers, the addresses, imagery, roads?
Yeah, I mean, I just think of these as kind of the core 6, right? You've got address points, you've got street center lines, imagery, LiDAR, municipal boundaries, and parcels.
Awesome.
And I mean, I think, if a GIO's office, state GIO's office is going to coordinate with locals and get those data sets aggregated and made accessible. If they just do that, there's so much love to be found by the data using community. I mean, there are other things to pursue as well, but those just to me are just the absolute foundation.
Yeah, that's a great list. I was thinking maybe we may have to turn that into a blog post, Bert's top 6 layers. Okay, just a couple more questions. And again, feel free to keep asking as we have a few more minutes here with everyone. Do you know if 4G/5G coverage, LTE, or cellular data is tied into what the FCC does with broadband at the national level? And the other comment here is some people are relying on these type of connections for work and education.
Yes, so the answer is yes. Both wireline and wireless broadband services are included in what the FCC is doing. So the data collection under the new Broadband Data Act does include both of those.
Interesting.
Just a real quick illustration. We had a multi-day power outage in a lot of the Salt Lake City neighborhoods this week, and I guess it was last week. And with the power out, a lot of the internet was down. And we also have so many people working at home and trying to go to school at home. And the networks are mostly built for download, and they're not built for the upload of video conferencing. And like everyone was just like, okay, I don't have any power. I don't have any landline based internet. I'm just going to do the Zoom meetings that I normally do on my cell phone. And that pretty much broke the network for a few hours until people figured out that that just wasn't going to happen. And I mean, it was essentially a texting only world for probably 2 or 3 hours in the morning after that storm.
Back to the late 90s, I guess. All right. Well, that does look like it wraps up all of our questions. So we'll be able to end right on time here. I want to thank all of our presenters today and especially all of our attendees. We had a great audience today, and you'll see some contact information there if you want to reach out directly. And AppGeo will be distributing a copy of this recording to you all in a couple days as well. So we thank you for attending. And any closing remarks from you three?
Well, thank you for attending.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Appreciate it.